Welcome everyone to this fifth edition of the 30 Days of Activism led by I Climate Action Initiative to see how we can spotlight women's resiliency in climate action and to see different perspectives. How far so far have we been able to achieve women's rights in a challenging work? And looking at the fact that women are bearing the brunt of the climate change crisis, it shows that women's rights will definitely be affected by the climate change crisis. Hence, we need to include women-related, gender-sensitive approach in dealing with the defining issue of our time. And most importantly, today's edition is on women's land rights and livelihoods. How do we strengthen women's rights, or how do we strengthen livelihoods through women's rights to resources such as land, water, other things that we need to have an equal right in assessing and dealing with the crisis that is defining us currently. And so with me today, I have Bernadette that is going to be telling us more about herself briefly, because she does quite a number of things in Asia and across the globe. So she's going to be introducing herself to us. She's very well known and an expert when it comes to gender-related and livelihood issues. So thank you for coming. It is such a great honor having you here.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching out. So my name is Dr. Bernadette Resurreccion, and I am currently an associate professor at the Global Development Studies Department of Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. And prior to that, I was a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Much of my work has really been focused on looking at gender and social justice dimensions of natural resource management and of environment. So I look at issues of agriculture, all related issues such as water use, for instance, and increasingly I'm looking at climate change as well as disaster contexts and looking at gender and social justice dimensions of such contexts. That in a nutshell is my work, which probably spans about 20 years or so.
Wow, that is such a lot, a large year, 2 decades or more that you have been trying to research on all of these issues. And very well, I'm also an agricultural economist, a first-class graduate, and I really respect the fact that he also mentioned agriculture, because agriculture is the mainstay of a country, of any nation, to see that it's able to feed its population, is able to cater for the needs of the people, and they also employ large group of people, employment, even food. So I'm also wondering, just to start with my first question with you, that talks on the fact that how do women's rights, especially to resources like land, water, and other things, could help to strengthen livelihood options? Because I read through some of your written articles, even books that mention these aspects that you have dwelt on livelihood, gender, the rest. So I'm keen to know, how does women's rights, especially to different resources, could help to strengthen livelihood options?
Yeah, thanks for that question. When we talk about women's rights, we talk first, of course, in terms of their access rights to resources, how well are they able to access specific resources. You said water, you said other inputs such as, for instance, knowledge, other productive inputs, and all that with respect to actually building livelihoods. That would be the first thing you have to find out, whether women do have access to these resources and what are the constraints. What are the constraints that they face in trying to access such resources? Are they cultural in nature? Are there certain norms, for instance, that constrain women to access these resources, to be able to build and strengthen their livelihoods? Are there certain forms of discrimination against women that act as barriers for them to be able to use such resources? So it can be something that's culturally created, but it can also be something that is part of the wider conditions, part of the wider political economic conditions that actually constrain not only women, but certain types of other groups, such as, for instance, the poor, such as certain ethnic groups, certain racialized groups, from being able to fully realize a viable livelihoods for themselves, for their children, and to realize sustainable futures. So it could be also that certain structures in society actually hinder certain groups, certain types of women, and certain other types of people from enabling livelihoods. This can be in the form of persistent poverty. This can be in the form of lack of access to, productive skills. It can also be a lot of other forms of discrimination that actually sort of relegate and confine marginalized peoples to continue being marginalized, and there are no support systems, there are no support networks that actually enable them to realize alternative livelihoods and futures.
Thank you so much. You mentioned quite a number of points. You talk about culture, and culture is one of the non-climatic drivers that affect women's rights, and it interacts with climatic-driven crises such as floods, droughts, and other natural disasters or climate crises that affect women's rights. So all of these cultural issues too has to do with how it affects women and girls, which you have just mentioned right now. And looking at areas that you've specialized or you've worked on, I came across a book that you wrote, Negotiating Gender Expertise on Environment and Development Voice from Feminist Political Ecology. What does that mean in the summarized version? I came across one of the book you wrote, and it talks about negotiating gender expertise in environment and development voice from feminist political ecology. So I'm wondering, what is the summary of what is in this book? Because I know it contained quite a number of ideas, solutions, and all. What is it trying to tell us in modern days? How does it interact with women's or gender rights?
Okay, so that book is all about gender experts, gender professionals, shall we say, who work in organizations that are concerned with environmental issues, environment and development issues, such as, for instance, energy-related issues, such as water issues, such as agricultural issues, such as climate change issues and disaster issues. So we find more and more women, well, not only women, but really gender experts, because some of them are men too. So we find a lot of gender experts in this context, working professionally in this context. So the book is about their dilemmas, considering that many of these organizations are very much science-led, considering that there are hierarchies of knowledge between those who are scientists and those who are gender experts, because the main mandate of gender expert is actually to transform society and to advance issues of gender equality and social justice. But this is somehow considered as secondary or even peripheral to the work of scientists, let's say in the realm of climate change or in the realm of energy, who are largely coming from different disciplines, from technical and natural science disciplines. And therefore, there are, as a result, hierarchies of knowledge in these workplaces, in these work contexts. So the book is about these hierarchies, navigating such dilemmas, navigating such difficult environments, if you like, by these gender experts. And we come to realize that really there are hierarchies of knowledge, what we refer to as the politics of knowledge, with regards to working in science-led organizations. And the other thing also that we highlight in this book is the fact that gender experts are very agile and very, shall we say, creative in navigating these dilemmas, in navigating these hierarchies and politics of knowledge. So the book is really about much of what they do in this navigation, working with technical people, always actually when it comes to priorities, let's say in the organization, gender and social justice are sort of relegated as something secondary, are considered as well as something soft and non-scientific. So the book is really all about that and how gender experts work in such environments.
Okay, very well, very well. So I also saw the fact that you sponsored projects, you lead sponsored projects on climate adaptation, gender, water stress in Southeastern Asia. And so I want to see what are the practical examples in this area of studies, maybe previous or current, on how women in control of resources help to strengthen these livelihood options through your research, your project, and the rest.
Well, one of the ways they really strengthen their options and widen their options is really to self-organize. I think there is no substitute to women and people organizing themselves to create, shall we say, more bargaining power, to create a sense of to create actually platforms of negotiation with those in power. So one thing is the fact that, well, there are different problems. Women as well as marginalized peoples experience different problems, but they do become a stronger force when they do galvanize their own strength at self-organizing, to be able to. And one of the things that I am increasingly recognizing, I mean, I've known it before, but I'm actually seeing it and hearing it from other organizations and from other activist organizations, is really what we call to be science from below. That people often we're often sort of tied to the idea that universities, Western knowledge, expert knowledge would have the best tools and knowledge to actually work through the problems that people face, especially climatic, environmental related problems. But what we are not seeing is that people on the ground are actually doing things for themselves, actually have very, very valuable knowledge to share, and very valuable knowledge that actually is useful in let's say, adapting to increasing global warming, etc. But that said, this is not to say that we should leave them alone. That said, I think what the rest of us can do, and what the world can do, and what institutions can do, is actually support their efforts, give them lots of seats in the deliberative table, in deliberations and decision making, because they do have valuable knowledge. And I think it's there's a lot of evidence now, lots of research now that actually demonstrate that they are able to actually address increasing problems in the environment as well as in climate change.
Thank you so much. Well said. And just to ask this concluding question on what are the missing links when it comes to women's rights and livelihoods, what did you think? You know, we have seen that figures, statistics, data have shows that women are the world's poorest, despite the fact that we produces 60 to 80% of food production, but yet the limited right to resources and other things are affecting women's full contribution in innovation, ideas, in different aspects in solving the defining issue of our time. So what are the missing link? Where are we missing it when it comes to that issue? Because this is a long overdue crisis that we keep fighting, and we don't want it to move on to the next generation to keep on fighting this issue. We want to be an issue that will be resolved in this 21st century and not to be taken over to the next century. So what do you think lies this missing link in this two connection of women's rights and livelihood?
Yeah. Okay. So over the years, I've really sort of come to the conclusion that women's work, women's livelihoods, and women's labor when it comes to realizing their livelihoods considered really something undervalued. Very little value is assigned to women's work, to women's labor, to women's positioning in livelihoods. It is considered as non-work. It is considered as care work. And therefore, the value being assigned to this is really, really low. And when I think about why this is so, it's not just a cultural phenomenon. Yes, it can be a form of discrimination. It can be a form of, shall we say, unequal gender norms, but can also be part of an overall way of, shall we say, an overall political and economic system whereby the use of resources, resource extraction, and for that matter, the need for economic growth actually persists or derives its, shall we say, its persistence from the fact that people, and especially women's labor, are kept cheap, are kept undervalued. So it is a system, I will call it a capitalist system that thrives on cheap labor, undervalued labor, and most of the time, this is also female labor. And this sort of filters through all of society. It combines with certain cultural, sociocultural norms that actually also considers women's labor as something that is of lesser value. So it's a huge struggle to actually wage. And we find that there are forces around, political, economic, cultural forces, institutional forces that continue to keep women's contribution to agriculture, to livelihoods, to the economy as being persistently undervalued. This is the same with the way natural resources are continuously extracted and continuously considered as something at the disposal of human beings. That's something we should harness and exploit. And so it's a shall we say, it's two things at the same time going on, parallel but related. On one hand, people's labor has to be kept at a very cheap rate or considered of low value. Women's labor especially considered very elastic because they're considered as caregivers, and care is something not given high value, shall we say. And at the same time, natural resources constantly being extracted and considered as cheap, as disposable, as exploitable. These two things are going on at the same time. And to me, increasingly, it dawns on me that these are the two things that are at the root of our problems. It is the root of inequality, and it is also the root of things like climate change or environmental degradation, where natural resources are continuously being harnessed, exploited, and extracted for purposes of the accumulation of wealth. So you have here, on one hand, a few getting richer and richer, but really subsisting and depending on the undervalued work of others, women included. And so, therefore, when we talk of rights, we have to think of justice, environmental justice, gender justice, climate justice. That would therefore address precisely the persistent inequalities by such a system, a neoliberal capitalist system that continuously subsists on the marginal work of others and the exploitation of natural resources.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. This concluding part really tells it all. You mentioned accumulation of wealth, and I came across a studies that was yesterday when it talks about eradicating poverty will mean more emissions. It's really, really, really ridiculous to say, because you could imagine when people are poor and then they are talking about, instead of us trying to merge it with sustainability, how to lift people out of poverty, just because of some people accumulating wealth, it is making some people to be poorer. And now the report is saying that eradicating poverty could make people emission to rise. And I think we need to rethink on all of these aspects. Women are bearing the brunt of the climate change crisis very well. And I think one of those things you mentioned too, you talked about capitalism, that it tends to devalue women's bargaining power or livelihood options, low pay and the rest. And we need to dismantle all of this kind of system that will not enable women's rights to strive. It has to start from now to see how we can have a breakthrough in all of these aspects, because I believe that everyone has a solution when it comes to solving crisis, and no one should be left behind. And a solution to one of these sustainable development goals, gender, climate change, energy, education, and the rest, could lead to solutions to all of those goals. And so it's very well important for us to see that we keep including women's related knowledge. That means gender sensitive approaches in different aspects of our economy sectors that could help to foster these things. And it also it tells on us about the gender bill of different countries. For some countries that they reject it, just like Nigeria. I'm so surprised that we are yet to pass the gender action bill that could help women, to break free from cultural, traditional, will I say templates or things that could affect their rights. So everyone has a right, and that right has a solution to give in terms of solving crisis. And so women should not be left behind, because their contribution, just only their indigenous knowledge, helps to solve solutions within their community, not to talk of the country at large. So we need to keep including more women in order for us to strengthen our livelihood, because we could see that the poverty level is increasing globally, food insecurity, and yet women have this capability to produce despite the fact that they have limited rights. So now imagine if they could have full rights to own all of these resources or have access to these resources. They have the capability to make use of these resources sustainably and benefit from it in a way that is going to impact the society very well. So we really, really appreciate your presence in your perspective that you shared today, Benedict, and we are looking forward to hearing more of you collaboration, partnership, and the rest. And I know you will also respond to our call next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for reaching out, Adenike.
Yes.
I hope I pronounced your name right,
Yes.
but it was lovely. It was lovely chatting with you, and all the best with your work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.